And so begins my coverage of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and we got a trailer. Sort of. We got a title and a blurb, which is good enough for me. If you don't know me, The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are, two of my favorite books of all time. I'm absolutely obsessed with this series. I've grown up with it. I started getting into this as a fan of the movies as a kid when they were coming out, and my love for the series has done nothing but grow since then. So when I heard that Amazon was making an adaptation of some of the material of Middle-earth, I was initially pretty skeptical. I didn't want them to tarnish my image of The Lord of the Rings on screen. But then again, I thought, the Hobbit movies came out, they weren't as good, and that didn't manage to tarnish my opinion of The Lord of the Rings in any way. So I thought, okay, we'll let this one go. But then again, Amazon has been hit or miss with their TV shows and including some of their adaptations. So I'm still a bit cautious, but excited at the same time. We still have a bit of a way to go until the show premieres, but until then, we'll just have to sit and wait and hope for the best. So let's get into it and break this stuff down. So what do we know about the show already? Well, leading up to this, we've gotten a few tidbits of information about the show, namely that it's going to be taking place during the Second Age of Middle-earth, which include events which of course happened long before the actual events of The Lord of the Rings, but they tie in directly, and we even saw some of what happened probably in this show in the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring. We also got this image, which so many people have talked about in the past before. I think a lot of people speculated when this first came out that it might be the Undying Lands, but since we've gotten confirmation that the show is going to be about the Second Age, I can only guess that it's Númenor. But now coming into this new information, we finally have a release date. It is coming out September 2nd of this year, and we have a title for the show, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and that title and the trailer came with a little description. Amazon Studios' forthcoming series brings to screens for the very first time the heroic legends of the fabled Second Age of Middle-earth's history. This epic drama is set thousands of years before the events of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and will take viewers back to an era in which great powers were forged, kingdoms rose to glory and fell to ruin, unlikely heroes were tested, hope hung by the finest of threads, and the greatest villain that ever flowed from Tolkien's pen threatened to cover all the world in darkness. Beginning in a time of relative peace, the series follows an ensemble cast of characters, both familiar and new, as they confront the long-feared re-emergence of evil to Middle-earth. From the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains, to the majestic forests of the elf capital of Lindon, to the breathtaking island kingdom of Númenor, to the furthest reaches of the map, these kingdoms and characters will carve out legacies that live long after they are gone. So as this description talks about, and as the title, The Rings of Power, suggests, this is going to be about the end of the Second Age and the forging of the Rings of Power. And although the trailer itself doesn't show any actual footage of the show, it shows an artistic interpretation of the words of the title being cast as if they were rings. But they actually released a behind the scenes where they did this practically, and I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. It shows that they're taking that extra step to do things the right way instead of just CGing the whole thing. Not to say I'm against CGI, like there's plenty of great movies that have lots of CGI, including the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I like that they're taking that extra step just to do it in person. So now that we know the show is probably going to be about Númenor and its fall and the making of the Rings of Power, this implies a couple of things. Firstly, that they'll probably be drawing most of their source material from the Accompanying, which is a section of the Silmarillion. If you don't know what the Silmarillion is, it's essentially the lore book of Lord of the Rings and reads almost like the Bible, where it's broken down into a bunch of shorter stories that each talk about a part of Middle-earth's history. The Silmarillion really focuses on the first age of Middle-earth's history, the events of Lord of the Rings taking place in the third age, but the Accompanying takes place in the second between the two. And the Accompanying deals with the island of Númenor, of its rise and eventual fall, which we learned about in The Lord of the Rings. And the show will probably draw from Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is the following section in the Silmarillion, which deals with the creation of the rings, the rise of Sauron, and eventually to the last alliance of elves and men, who we see fighting against Sauron in the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. I wonder if they're going to take a more straightforward, almost literal approach to adapting the material, kind of like how the movies did. There were some changes in the movies, of course, but the main trajectory of the movie stayed very faithful. Or I wonder if they're going to take that source material. There's not really as much material dealing with Númenor, even though it's covered in the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, of course, as there was about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So they'll probably draw their own interpretations of some things and have some creative decisions where they're inventing probably new characters, new storylines. A lot of people have struggled with adaptations that make decisions that kind of betray the source material. A lot of people were upset with the Wheel of Time adaptation. I've only read the first 2 books and I'm reading the 3rd, so I don't know too much of how this show has strayed from the material, but a lot of people were upset when it took these kind of crazy decisions that were completely different from what the books were doing. When it came out that the show was going to be about the Second Age, of course we can draw our own conclusions, but knowing that the show is titled The Rings of Power, we can probably assume that it's going to focus on some key people. Namely Sauron, of course, he who forged the One Ring, but he has a lot of involvement actually in the fall of Númenor, so seeing him not only make the rings but be involved on the Númenor side of things is going to be really interesting, and we'll probably have to spend a lot of time with him. We'll probably also get to know the character of Celebrimbor a lot. Celebrimbor is the elf who made the other Rings of Power, not the One Ring, under Sauron's guidance when Sauron was pretending to be a good guy, but specifically he made the 3 rings for the elves outside of Sauron's guidance, so they weren't totally under the control of the One Ring like the other ones were, which of course turned the ones that the men had into the Nazgul. And if you've played the Shadow of Mordor games, you probably know who Celebrimbor is. He's featured heavily in those, although I believe the games take the source material with a bit of a fast and loose attitude. And I can sort of see how the arc of the show is probably going to be setting things up in Númenor and how it's peaceful there, like it said in the blurb for the trailer. And eventually seeing how Sauron starts manipulating people in Númenor, leading to the rise of characters like Ar-Pharazôn and his journey to the west. And then seeing characters among the faithful like Isildur and Elendil, who are characters we saw in the Fellowship of the Ring. And of course, as has gone with the casting, we're probably going to see some familiar faces like Galadriel. I'm also really interested to see how Elrond is going to factor into this, because his family history ties in very importantly with the history of Númenor and the line of kings there. And I wonder where the show is going to end up. We know what happens with Isildur and Elendil and Sauron, and eventually that Isildur falls at the Gladden Fields and loses the ring, where it's next picked up after so many years by Gollum. And of course, Isildur is the ancestor of Aragorn. And I like that they're doing the Second Age. The more that I've thought about this, the more I think that this is the right choice, especially considering that their other option was to do something like a young Aragorn, which I wouldn't have been super into, although there's information there from the books about what he was up to as a young man. Or even adapting stuff from the First Age in the Silmarillion. I could see the only way kind of that working would be an anthology, but it would be really tough to kind of execute and kind of confusing for a lot of people, especially if they are more casual fans or know The Lord of the Rings mostly only from the movies, to jump all the way back to the First Age, which essentially covers the creation story in the Ainulindale. I can't imagine how that would be properly adapted. There are some great stories there that I could see definitely being adapted, like the burning of the ships and Turin Turambar, Beren and Luthien, the fall of Gondolin especially. That would be really cool. But they're smaller stories and they don't tie in as closely to The Lord of the Rings as the stuff in the Second Age does. We've seen directly how the stuff in the Second Age ties in directly to the events of The Lord of the Rings, with Isildur losing the ring, the creation of the rings, the elves and men, seeing Elrond there. So this show could really carve out its own identity as being about Númenor and what goes on there and the creation of the rings, without it being too referential on the Lord of the Rings movies, kind of how the Hobbit films did. I feel like they suffered a lot from having to tie it in too closely to the Lord of the Rings when the Hobbit is more of its own story. But having this be about the Rings of Power automatically gives them a tie into the Lord of the Rings where people can instantly make that connection, but it being separate enough that it could be its own story. So that's it for now. That's my little discussion of what we got about this title and this little trailer here. Let me know in the comments if you're excited for this show and what you thought about all this new information. Also, let me know if you're interested, like me, in how they're doing the Second Age material. Would you rather have seen stuff from the First Age or more of a direct prequel to The Lord of the Rings where it is about like a young Aragorn or something like that? Let me know. Before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.